I remember exactly where I was when my mother called to tell me she and my father had finally gotten married. Sitting in my cramped kitchen, half awake and nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee, I listened as she spoke in a hurried, almost excited tone. At first, I thought she was sharing news about a friend or distant relative, but when she said, "Your father and I tied the knot last weekend," I nearly choked on my drink. I fumbled for words, my mind struggling to reconcile the fact that my parents, together for nearly 3 decades, had never actually been legally married. That was bizarre enough. Yet, what truly stung was the realization that I hadn't received an invitation or even a hint that this event was happening. My mother carried on about how it had been a tiny, intimate ceremony and that nobody really came except a few close friends. I hung on every word, waiting for the moment she'd explain why her only child wasn't considered close enough to be included. Instead, she stumbled through a vague apology, sounding more guilty than remorseful. She insisted it was simply easier to keep the ceremony low-key. Perhaps they thought my presence would complicate matters, or they just didn't want to bother with me. Either way, I felt blindsided. I'd grown up believing they were already married. They'd worn rings and celebrated anniversaries, telling me stories of their wedding day. Now I learned those stories had been fabrications or half-truths. The phone line hummed with tension as I struggled to respond. Eventually, I stammered out a hollow congratulations, more out of shock than genuine happiness. Inside, I could feel something collapsing, a sense of trust I hadn't realized was so fragile. The revelation sliced through me like a jagged blade, leaving me speechless. The next day, I grappled with my conflicting emotions. Should I confront them, demand explanations, or quietly nurse my wounds? Feeling lost, I reached out to my paternal grandmother, a straightforward woman who always defended me. When I told her the news, she erupted in anger, furious that her own son had orchestrated such a secret ceremony. She told me she hadn't known about it either. Hearing her outrage validated the hurt I felt. Then I called my maternal grandparents, who lived states away, and discovered they too were blindsided. Neither side of the family had been invited or informed. My mother's parents were livid, and in their shock, they insisted this slight wouldn't go unaddressed. Within days, my grandparents had begun discussing ways to give my parents a taste of their own medicine. It was almost comical how quickly the two sets of grandparents, who often disagreed over trivial things, united in shared indignation. They felt my parents needed a stark reminder of what it meant to exclude one's own flesh and blood. While they hatched plans, I paced through my apartment, trying to make sense of everything. Part of me just wanted an apology, something genuine to fix the rupture. But as the days passed without any gesture from my parents, anger replaced longing. Soon, a family conference call took place, grandparents on both sides talking over each other as they brainstormed how to proceed. They proposed we organize a massive family reunion without telling my parents. At first, I balked at the idea. It seemed spiteful. Yet, the more I thought about it, the more I saw it as fitting payback. Let them experience the sting of being left out. Justice might be messy, but it was certainly overdue. I ended the call feeling oddly empowered, ready. In the following weeks, our plan gathered momentum. My grandparents contacted relatives far and wide, inviting them to a grand celebration at the old family homestead near my paternal grandparents' town. Cousins I hadn't seen since childhood promised to come. Everyone was sworn to secrecy. The entire event would be dedicated to honoring family roots, celebrating heritage, and paying tribute to ancestors. We planned a ceremony in the local chapel to remember my great-grandfather, followed by a reception featuring music, dancing, and more homemade food than anyone could possibly eat. My role involved helping arrange logistics, from booking the band to organizing decorations. My paternal grandmother and I spent hours sorting through dusty photo albums, selecting images that would be displayed on large boards for everyone to see. Each picture reminded me of a time when I believed my parents were a stable unit, loving and trustworthy. At moments, guilt gnawed at me. Was I stooping to their level, perpetuating a cycle of exclusion? But every time that thought arose, I recalled the humiliation and heartache I felt when I first learned of their secret wedding. They hadn't merely overlooked me, they'd intentionally chosen to hide the ceremony from everyone who should have mattered. So yes, a part of me craved to see their stunned faces once they realized they were the ones locked out. Late at night, I'd drift into uneasy sleep, torn between anger and the remnants of love I still felt for my parents. Revenge, even when justified, is rarely clean. I pressed forward, determined not to let them off easy. This was about accountability, about teaching them the impact of their choices. As plans solidified, I sensed a powerful current carrying me toward a confrontation I both dreaded and welcomed, uncertain how it might finally unfold. The day of the reunion arrived under bright sunshine and a gentle breeze. Family members descended upon the chapel, each greeting me with warm smiles and words of support. My grandparents on both sides kept me close, as though aware of the emotional weight I carried. In that sacred space, we lit candles for those who had passed, read their names aloud, and reminisced about their legacy. My chest tightened with conflicting emotions, mourning not just the dead, but also the familial bond my parents had shattered. After the service, everyone moved to the homestead. The band played upbeat tunes, children ran across the lawn, and the tantalizing aroma of roast chicken and freshly baked pies wafted through the air. There were photographs on display, a collage of our shared history. I couldn't help but notice countless pictures where my parents stood beside me. Their absence that day was a striking reminder of how drastically things had changed. For hours, I laughed, caught up with relatives, and even danced a little, but a knot of tension sat coiled in my belly, knowing this celebration had a hidden edge of retribution. At sunset, while sipping homemade lemonade, I felt my phone buzz incessantly. My father's name flashed on the screen, accompanied by rapid texts. Apparently, someone had slipped up, or perhaps a distant cousin had let the news spill. My parents knew about the reunion and were outraged at being excluded. A tight smile curved my lips as I realized the moment of confrontation had arrived. My grandparents surrounded me, ready to offer support. I inhaled slowly, bracing myself for the storm. They had played their hand first, and now it was my turn to show them exactly how it felt to be left in the dark. My phone kept vibrating. I excused myself from the crowd and found a quiet corner behind the house. With trembling fingers, I answered my father's call. The instant I said hello, his voice blasted through the speaker, a mix of fury and disbelief. "How dare you throw a family reunion and not invite us?" he shouted. My mother's angry muttering filtered in the background. My heart pounded, but I forced calm into my voice. "I thought keeping things small and intimate was just simpler," I said. There was a brief silence before he roared, "Don't you dare throw our words back at us!" But that was exactly what I intended. My mother then took the phone, her voice trembling. "How could you exclude your own parents? We're family," she cried. A bitter laugh escaped me. "Family?" I echoed. "You mean the same family you left out when you decided to get married without telling a soul?" The line went dead quiet, and for a moment I thought they'd hung up. Then my father snarled, "That was different. We had our reasons." I steadied my breathing, remembering how painful it had been to find out secondhand. "And we have ours," I replied quietly. "Consider this an object lesson in how it feels to be kept outside the loop." My mother began to sob, saying something about ungrateful, but I felt only a grim sense of finality. Years of pent-up frustration spilled into each syllable I spoke. They had played the victim, painting me as disrespectful. Now they were tasting the consequences of their own betrayal. Before either could speak again, I ended the call, tears burning my eyes. This was the brutal side of revenge. It left no room for easy reconciliation. But I'd had enough of bending to their whims. This time, I stood. After hanging up, I remained there, staring at the setting sun. My hands shook, and my heart felt like it might beat out of my chest. I wasn't sure if I was about to collapse or burst into triumphant laughter. A strange mixture of sorrow and liberation coursed through me. It struck me then how quickly life can flip, leaving you both vindicated and hollow. This was what I'd wanted, wasn't it? I wanted them to feel that same sting of exclusion. Well, they felt it now, but nothing about it was satisfying. I wiped my eyes and rejoined the gathering. My grandparents instantly noticed my shaken expression. They ushered me to a quiet corner where I relayed the phone conversation. Both sets nodded grimly, sharing my conflicted feelings. We clinked glasses in a silent toast to standing up for ourselves, even if it hurt. Soon, the music drew us back, and I let myself dance with cousins and friends, forcing the pain aside for a brief reprieve. Around midnight, the party began to wind down. people retreated to their lodgings, weary but content. I lingered under the canopy of stars with my grandparents, wondering what awaited us next. "Do you think they'll ever come around?" I asked quietly. My paternal grandmother sighed, dabbing at her eyes. "I hope so, but I won't hold my breath." We stood there in silence, acknowledging that our act of retribution had drawn a line in the sand. If my parents wanted back in our lives, they'd have to swallow their pride and offer real remorse. It was a heavy truth, but also necessary. When I finally went to bed, my mind reeled with visions of their anger, our confrontation, and the uncertain future. I clutched the blankets tightly, torn between regret and relief. In the days that followed, I expected an onslaught of phone calls or texts, but there was only silence. My parents seemed to vanish into their own world, licking wounds or building walls. Meanwhile, I returned to my routine, my editing job, nights spent reading or out with friends. Yet nothing felt quite the same. A heavy weight of finality clung to me, making each breath feel both freer and more somber. Occasionally, I'd catch myself scrolling through old photos, searching for some hint that this rift could be repaired. But the memory of their secret wedding still gnawed at me, reminding me that trust was broken the moment they chose to exclude everyone. About a week after the reunion, my grandmother on my father's side called to check on me. I admitted I felt both justified and guilty, and she soothed my turmoil with gentle words. "You did what you needed to do," she said. "If your parents can't see their own role in this, that's on them." I held on to that reassurance like a lifeline. Over the next few months, I threw myself into work, earning a promotion that gave me more creative freedom. My social circle expanded, and I found I had more emotional energy to invest in true friendships once I wasn't expending it on chasing my parents' approval. My grandparents remained a steadfast presence. We gathered for dinners, watched old movies, and occasionally reminisced about the family reunion with a mix of pride and sorrow. Slowly, I realized I no longer needed to justify my choice. What's done was done. The ball was in my parents' court if they ever wanted to bridge the gap. In protecting my dignity, I'd found a sense of self-worth that no amount of manipulation or guilt could ever erase. Then, about 6 months later, an unexpected envelope arrived in my mailbox. The handwriting was my father's, neat and distinct. Inside was a brief letter, less than a page long. My chest tightened as I read his words. He wrote that they regretted how everything had unfolded, yet the letter offered no true apology. Instead, it urged me to remember where your loyalty lies and reminded me that family should stand together. He closed by saying they hoped I'd drop my grudge. My hands shook with anger and disappointment. The tone was so condescending, as though I were a wayward child. No ownership of their secret wedding, no acknowledgement of the hurt they'd caused. I set the letter aside and deliberated for days. Part of me wanted to rip it to shreds and be done. Another part was tempted to meet them halfway, hoping we could rebuild some semblance of normalcy. But how could I trust people who felt entitled to my forgiveness without recognizing the gravity of their deception? Finally, I penned a response. I thanked them for reaching out, but made it clear I wouldn't move forward until they accepted their role in this fiasco. I pressed the letter into the mailbox with trembling resolve, uncertain whether it would kindle a genuine change or ignite another battle. Weeks passed, and I heard nothing. Their silence spoke volumes. If they truly sought reconciliation, they'd have to do better than vague entreaties. My grandparents supported my stance, insisting I had every right to guard my heart. Although it hurt, I was done granting them second chances at my expense. I refused to be the child they conveniently forgot whenever it suited them. My life was calmer without their constant demands. There was a bittersweet peace in knowing I was free. As more time passed, I focused on healing and forging my own path. My grandparents remained central to my life. We celebrated birthdays together, took small trips, and even dived into genealogy projects to uncover more of our family's history. The more I learned, the more I treasured the extended family that had embraced me so wholeheartedly at the reunion. My parents' absence still cut deep, but at least I knew where we stood. One afternoon, while sifting through old photos with my paternal grandfather, he came across an album from my childhood. Flipping through pages, I noticed how happy we all looked. "You were the light of their lives," my grandfather murmured, but somewhere along the line, they forgot how to show it. His words resonated, reminding me that people can love in deeply flawed ways. Still, love doesn't excuse disrespect or betrayal. Over the following year, my grandparents subtly kept tabs on my parents, informing me that my father's health wasn't great and my mother was struggling with loneliness. They'd apparently grown bitter and resentful, placing blame on everyone but themselves. It was hard to watch from a distance, knowing I couldn't fix what they refused to acknowledge. Sometimes I felt guilt gnaw at me. Other times I felt relief that I was no longer ensnared by their dramas. The grandparents urged me not to lose myself in pity. They reiterated that I deserved honest relationships. And so I pressed on, forging a future built on mutual respect, determined never to repeat their mistakes. Each new milestone in my life, small or big, was shared with the family that chose me, that stood by me when I needed them most. My parents had made their bed, and unless they owned up to their betrayal, I saw no reason to disturb those covers. Looking back, I see a transformation in myself I never thought possible. Once, I craved my parents' approval like oxygen. Now, I breathe freely without it. Their secret wedding was more than just a slight. It was a catalyst that forced me to draw boundaries. The revenge we enacted, organizing that grand reunion and locking them out, felt justified, a mirror reflecting their own betrayal back upon them. Its aftermath wasn't neat or pretty, but I discovered a core of strength I'd never known I possessed. I still have the photo album my grandfather compiled to commemorate that day. Every so often, I flip through it, recalling the music, the laughter, the bittersweet taste of standing up for myself. I'm not naive enough to believe everything is settled. My parents might someday attempt another reconciliation, or they might cling to anger. Either way, I've learned that forgiveness isn't a doormat to be walked on. It's a choice, one I can make if I see genuine remorse. Until then, I stand firm in the knowledge that my worth doesn't hinge on their acceptance. Ultimately, I have no regrets about giving them a taste of their own medicine. Some betrayals deserve no easy pardon, and as for me, I'm stronger, freer, and more certain of my place in the world than ever before. The child who once begged for scraps of attention is gone. In their place stands someone who knows exactly what she deserves and refuses to settle for less. If my parents wanted an obedient audience, they should have thought twice before shutting me out of their wedding. Because once I learned to shut the door, I realized I never needed their hollow love in the first place. Self-respect is a ruthless teacher, but it's also the sweetest revenge on betrayal. Peace.